Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to take a moment right now and think about the most important conversations you've had in your life. Whether it was with a loved one, a mentor, or a life-changing leader, these moments shaped you. They guided your decisions, clarified your path, and altered the course of your life. But here's the thing. What if I told you that God is speaking to you right now in ways that you might be overlooking? We often think of God's voice as being a loud, thunderous sound, a booming declaration that shakes us to our core. And yet, often the Creator is whispering to us in more subtle, everyday ways. His communication with us is not just confined to moments of prayer or study. It can be found in the physical signs around us, within us, and even in the situations we encounter. In this session, I want to explore 7 physical signs that God is speaking to you. These signs are not just coincidental. They are powerful, intentional, and tailored specifically for your journey. Open your heart, open your mind, and allow yourself to recognize the divine language all around you. Have you ever experienced a restlessness that you couldn't quite explain? It's that deep inner stirring that nags at you, that doesn't allow you to settle, no matter how hard you try. You've gone through the motions of your day, checked off all the boxes, but there's this sense that something isn't quite right. You might try to distract yourself, to push the feeling aside, but it keeps coming back stronger each time. What is that feeling? It's God speaking to you. Restlessness is not just a random passing emotion, it's often a divine nudge. When God wants to get our attention, He doesn't always speak in loud, clear voices. Sometimes He stirs your heart and spirit, placing a deep disquiet inside you. This restlessness is a call to action, a signal that there's something you need to address, something you need to face or change. It's God's way of moving you toward His will. Think about the story of a man named Michael. Michael had a stable career. Everything in his life seemed to be going well. He had a good job, a loving family, and a comfortable routine. But something inside him began to stir. He couldn't ignore it no matter how much he tried to focus on his work, his family, or his hobbies. He felt unsettled. At first, he thought it was stress from his job or perhaps anxiety about the future, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It became more intense. And no matter how much he tried to distract himself, it stayed. Michael's restlessness was not a mental issue. Nor was it just a byproduct of overwork. It was God reaching out, trying to redirect his path. One night, in desperation, Michael took time to pray, asking God for guidance. As he sat in quiet reflection, the restlessness suddenly made sense. God was urging him to leave his current job and pursue a dream he'd buried long ago, to start a nonprofit that could help underprivileged children. The feeling of discontent he'd been wrestling with for months was God's way of showing him that he had outgrown his current path, and it was time to step into a new season. The restlessness wasn't just discomfort, it was divine direction. Restlessness often precedes change. We see this pattern throughout Scripture. Abraham, for example, was called to leave his father's house and go to a place he had never seen before. The restlessness he felt in his spirit was God's invitation to step into the unknown, to trust in a future beyond what he could see with his eyes. Just as God called Abraham, He calls us. When your spirit is unsettled, when everything around you feels ordinary, but something inside you is whispering that there's more, it's time to listen. That internal stir is often God saying, I have more for you. It's time for you to move, to grow, to trust. But how often do we ignore this feeling? How often do we drown out the whispers with noise, distraction, or comfort? We fear the unknown. We cling to the familiar. But in doing so, we miss out on the blessings that come from following God's guidance. Restlessness is not something to be feared. It's something to be embraced. It's God's way of preparing you for what's next. You might be experiencing this restlessness today. Maybe it's in your job, your relationships, or your spiritual life. It's that persistent feeling that there's more, something greater on the horizon, but you don't quite know what it is yet. No, this God is speaking to you through that unease. It's His voice urging you to listen, to reflect, and to take a step of faith. When you recognize this divine restlessness, don't ignore it. Don't push it aside because it's uncomfortable. Instead, embrace it. Seek God in prayer. Ask Him to reveal the source of that stirring and be open to the change He's preparing you for. Restlessness is not a curse, it is an invitation to a greater purpose. There's a popular belief in today's world that anxiety and stress are simply symptoms of modern life, something we must live with, or something to be medicated away. While it's true that our fast-paced world can cause tension, we must understand that not all anxiety and stress are born from external circumstances. Sometimes God uses these physical signs to speak to us, to grab our attention when we've been too busy or too distracted to listen. These physical symptoms are more than just warning signs. They're divine indicators that something in our life is out of alignment with God's will. Imagine a person who's been running on empty, working long hours, juggling family responsibilities, and trying to maintain an image of success. For a while, they feel like they can handle it. But slowly, the stress begins to take its toll. They lose sleep, experience tension, headaches, and start to feel physically drained. They try to push through, but the symptoms only worsen. Eventually, their body starts to demand attention, signaling that they can no longer keep going at this pace. At this point, they might visit a doctor, get a diagnosis, or perhaps just collapse from exhaustion. But what if this physical stress is God trying to tell them something deeper? When God speaks to us through stress or anxiety, He's not punishing us, He's calling us to reevaluate our priorities. Just like Jonah, who tried to flee from God's calling and ended up in the belly of a great fish, our physical symptoms often reflect our spiritual state. We might be overwhelmed because we are not living in alignment with the divine purpose God has for us. We may be taking on more than we were meant to carry, neglecting our spiritual health, or ignoring God's prompting to change directions. Consider the story of Lisa, a woman who was a high-powered executive at a successful company. She was driven, ambitious, and proud of the life she had built. But one day she started feeling a deep anxiety that wouldn't go away. At first she thought it was just a temporary, phasey result of a heavy workload. But the anxiety soon turned into physical symptoms: insomnia, constant headaches, and a feeling of tightness in her chest. She went to the doctor, but no physical cause could be found. Her doctor told her it was stress, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play. In a moment of vulnerability, she turned to God in prayer. She asked for clarity, for peace, and for understanding. As she sat in the stillness, she realized that she had been ignoring her calling. She had been pursuing success at the expense of her family, her health, and her faith. The stress wasn't just a byproduct of her lifestyle, it was God's way of getting her attention, of showing her that something needed to change. Lisa began to make adjustments in her life, cutting back on work, spending more time with her family, and reconnecting with her spiritual purpose. Slowly, the physical symptoms began to ease, and peace began to return. When anxiety or stress becomes overwhelming, it is often a signal that we need to stop and listen. God speaks through these physical symptoms to help us reflect on where we are, how we are living, and whether we are following the path He has laid before us. These signs are not merely burdens to bear, but invitations to seek God's wisdom and realign our lives with His will. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by stress, instead of ignoring it or seeking immediate relief, take a moment to pause. Ask God if there's something in your life that needs to change. Seek His peace and His direction. Sometimes stress and anxiety are not just the result of life's pressures. They are God's way of speaking to you, inviting you into a deeper relationship with Him. One of the most significant ways God communicates with us is through the repetition of patterns or events in our lives. We might call them coincidences, but when they happen with such regularity and precision, we must consider the possibility that these occurrences are not random. In fact, they may be God's way of speaking to us. Repetitive situations, patterns, or encounters are often divine signals, urging us to pay attention to a message we might have missed the first time. Take, for example, a woman named Janet. Janet had been in one relationship after another, each one falling apart for almost the same reasons: lack of communication, unmet expectations, and ultimately a feeling of disconnection. After a series of failed relationships, Janet began to wonder if there was something wrong with her. Was she unlovable? Was she destined to never find true happiness? But as she reflected on her past, she realized that the same issues had repeated themselves in every relationship for her. Inability to set boundaries, her need to please others at the cost of her own well-being, and her avoidance of conflict. These patterns had become so familiar that Janet had normalized them. However, through prayer and introspection, she began to ask God what He was trying to teach her. The repeated experiences were not random. They were signals. God was showing Janet that she had a tendency to neglect her own needs for the sake of others. The repeated failures in her relationships weren't just coincidences. They were God's way of pointing out an area in her life that needed healing. Janet took these repeated patterns seriously, and as she worked on setting healthy boundaries and prioritizing self-care, she saw her relationships begin to change for the better. Janet's story is a powerful reminder that God speaks to us through repetition, using events or patterns that keep resurfacing to teach us crucial life lessons. These repetitive occurrences can happen in various forms. Maybe it's the same financial struggle that keeps showing up despite your best efforts. Maybe it's the same kind of conflict that appears with your colleagues or loved ones. Perhaps it's the same temptation that keeps pulling you back into old habits. All these repeated patterns are God's way of saying there is something here for you to learn. It's an invitation to stop and reflect. God doesn't want you to keep repeating the same mistakes. He's trying to break you free from the cycle and lead you into new wisdom and growth. The Apostle Paul speaks about the importance of learning from our struggles when he writes, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." Romans 5:3, -4. God often uses repetitive challenges to build resilience in us, to teach us patience, and to develop in us the character that will equip us for greater things. You may find yourself in the midst of a repeated situation that feels discouraging, but take heart. These patterns are not punishment, they are opportunities to grow. When you notice a repetitive event in your life, pause, reflect, and ask yourself, what is God trying to teach me through this? True peace, the peace that comes from God, is unlike any peace this world can offer. It doesn't depend on external circumstances or the absence of trouble. It transcends the chaos around us and settles deep within our hearts, even in the most difficult of times. When God speaks to us through peace, it's often in the midst of a storm. It's the kind of peace that doesn't make sense to the natural mind. Everything around you might be falling apart, yet you feel an unshakable sense of calm. I want to share a story about Tom, a man who faced the most harrowing season of his life. Tom's wife had just been diagnosed with a serious illness, and the doctors had given them little hope. They were told to prepare for the worst. Tom was devastated. He had prayed, cried, and sought God for a miracle, yet the situation seemed to worsen by the day. But then something strange began to happen. Despite his overwhelming fear and uncertainty, there was a deep peace that began to surround him. It wasn't the absence of worry, it was a peace that carried him through the darkest moments. One night, Tom was sitting by his wife's hospital bed, watching her struggle to breathe. He prayed for healing, but the peace he felt in his heart was undeniable. In that moment, he realized that no matter what the outcome, God was still in control. His peace was not rooted in the hope that his wife would be healed on his terms. It was rooted in the knowledge that God's will was greater than his understanding. This peace allowed Tom to be a source of strength for his wife, to comfort her with assurance and love, even when he himself didn't have all the answers. This peace is not about pretending that everything is okay when it's not. It's not about stuffing down your emotions or ignoring the reality of your struggles. It's about knowing deep down in your spirit that God is with you and that His presence is enough. It's the assurance that even in the worst of situations, God's hand is on your life and His plan is unfolding. Scripture tells us in Philippians 4-7 that the peace of God surpasses all understanding. This means that it is not a peace the world can give. When everything in your life seems to be spiraling out of control, when your circumstances say chaos, and yet you feel a calm in your spirit, that is God's peace speaking to you. That peace is His presence, affirming that He is with you, that He has not abandoned you, and that He is working behind the scenes even when you can't see it. Peace amidst chaos is not always about an immediate change in your circumstances. It's about the change within you. When you feel that deep, abiding peace, God is speaking to you in the most profound way. He's telling you, I am with you. You are not alone. You don't have to fear. Trust in my plan. We often try to find peace in external circumstances, new jobs, better relationships, financial security, but these things are temporary. True peace is found only in God. When the storms of life come in, they will come, and His peace will be the anchor that holds you firm, even when the winds of fear and doubt threaten to knock you down. If you find yourself in a season of peace, even in the midst of overwhelming circumstances, don't take it for granted. Embrace it. Recognize it for what it is. God speaking directly to your spirit, confirming His presence and assuring you that His peace is more powerful than any storm you might face. It is in these moments of deep peace that we can hear God's voice the clearest. Have you ever been wrestling with a decision or facing an overwhelming problem, unsure of what to do next, and then in a moment of quiet, an answer just comes to you? It might have felt like a sudden burst of insight, a clear direction that seemed to come from nowhere. In that instant, the fog clears, the confusion dissolves, and you have a sense of peace about the choice you need to make. This is often God speaking to you. God doesn't always speak through loud, dramatic encounters. Sometimes His voice is heard in the stillness. The noise of our daily lives, the distractions and the busyness can drown out His whisper. But in those moments when we stop, when we quiet our minds, God can speak to us with great clarity. The sudden insight you experience is often a divine answer, a guiding light that cuts through the chaos of uncertainty. Take, for example, Sarah, a woman facing a life-changing decision. She had been offered a great job opportunity in another city, but the move would require her to leave behind her family, friends, and everything she knew. She spent weeks debating whether to accept the offer, constantly overwhelmed by fear of the unknown. She prayed earnestly, but the decision still felt like a burden clouded by doubt. One evening, after weeks of inner turmoil, Sarah took a walk alone in the park. As she sat on a bench, the noise of her thoughts began to fade away. For the first time in weeks, she just sat in silence, not trying to solve the problem, but simply being present. It was in that quiet moment that a sudden sense of clarity came over her. She knew without a doubt that accepting the job was the right choice. It wasn't just a logical decision, it was a deep inner peace that confirmed her next step. This kind of clarity is not something that comes from our own understanding. It's something higher, something beyond our own reasoning. It's the wisdom of God breaking through into our lives. When you experience a sudden insight or direction, it's often the result of God's quiet voice guiding your heart. It's in the silence, in the moments when we stop striving and start listening, that God's wisdom becomes clear. Consider the times in Scripture when God gave insight in moments of stillness. In the Old Testament, when Elijah sought the Lord in the wilderness, he didn't find God in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, he heard God in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. This illustrates how God often speaks not through dramatic events, but in quiet, subtle ways. When you find yourself in a moment of peace, in a space where the noise of the world quiets, take the time to listen. God may be speaking to you, giving you clarity where there was once confusion. The key to hearing God's voice in moments of silence is to trust the peace that comes with the insight. This peace is often a sign that God is aligning your thoughts with His will. If you're facing a decision and you feel an overwhelming sense of clarity or assurance, it might be that God is confirming His plan for you. This insight is not something to be doubted, it is a divine confirmation. Sometimes we second guess the clarity we receive, thinking it's too simple, too easy, or even too good to be true. But when we allow ourselves to be still, when we truly listen, we'll find that God's guidance is both powerful and peaceful. If you've experienced this sudden clarity, take it as God speaking directly into your life. Trust that He is guiding you, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. There are moments in our lives when we feel an almost overwhelming urge to pray or worship. These urges come in different forms. Sometimes they hit us unexpectedly in the middle of our daily routines. Other times they come in moments of great emotional weight, when our hearts are heavy with worry, doubt, or fear. These physical urgings are often signs that God is speaking to us, calling us into deeper communion with Him. There is something profound about a physical, spiritual pull to pray or worship. It's as if your heart knows before your mind does that you need to draw closer to God. Have you ever been in the middle of your day, perhaps feeling stressed, anxious, or burdened, and then felt an intense desire to simply pray or sing praises? This isn't a random feeling. It's God moving within you, urging you to come before Him, to release your cares, and to be refilled with His presence. Think of David, the great king and psalmist, who was often moved to worship in the most unexpected of moments. Even as a young shepherd, David would pour out his heart in song to God, worshiping Him in the quiet fields. His worship was not limited to the temple or to formal occasions. It was a constant physical response to God's presence and greatness. David understood that worship wasn't just something you do when everything is going well. It's a response to God's ongoing involvement in your life. One powerful example comes from a woman named Maria, who had been struggling with feelings of hopelessness after a series of personal setbacks. She was burdened by a sense of failure and uncertainty about her future. One day, while walking home from work, she suddenly felt an intense, almost overwhelming urge to pray. The feeling was so strong that she had to stop and find a quiet place to kneel down. As she prayed, the heaviness in her spirit began to lift. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks, as if God Himself was comforting her. In that moment, Maria realized that the physical pull to pray was God's invitation to surrender her worries to Him, to trust Him with her burdens. These physical urges to pray or worship are often divine moments of connection. God is calling us to step into His presence, to find rest, strength, and guidance. When you feel this physical pull, don't ignore it. It's not just an emotional response or a fleeting thought. It's God drawing you closer, inviting you into a deeper relationship. It's in these moments that God speaks to your spirit, offering comfort, wisdom, and sometimes even the answers you've been seeking. The physical urge to pray or worship is also a reminder that we are not meant to live life on our own strength. In times of struggle, when we feel weak or uncertain, God invites us to come to Him, not just in our thoughts, but with our whole being. Worship and prayer are not just acts of religion, they are powerful ways in which we can experience God's presence and receive His guidance. If you've ever been moved to pray in a moment of uncertainty, know that it's God speaking to you. It's His invitation to pause, to lean into Him, and to experience His peace and direction. These moments are not coincidences. They are divine moments of intimacy when God calls you closer to His heart. Don't miss the opportunity when you feel the physical urge to pray. Step into that moment and let God speak to you. Have you ever experienced a thought or idea that seemed to enter your mind out of nowhere? Perhaps it's a thought that keeps coming back over and over, almost like a nagging reminder that you can't shake. These thoughts often seem illogical or impractical at first, but they continue to return, stirring your heart and mind. As time goes on, these ideas evolve and you start to feel an urge to take action. Something deep within you tells you that this is the right path, even if you can't quite explain why. This is often one of the most powerful ways that God speaks to us, through persistent, unexplainable thoughts that lead us to take steps of faith. These kinds of thoughts can take many forms. It might be the idea of starting a new business or pursuing a career path that you've never considered before. It could be the thought of reaching out to someone you've lost touch with, or even offering a helping hand to someone in need, though it might seem inconvenient or unexpected. God often speaks to us through these persistent thoughts, pushing us beyond our comfort zones and urging us toward the plans He has for our lives. Consider the story of Jake, a man who had been living a relatively comfortable life, but one day he began to feel an overwhelming urge to volunteer at a homeless shelter in his city. At first, Jake didn't understand why. He had a busy career, a young family, and little time for anything else. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the thought of helping at the shelter kept resurfacing. It wasn't just a fleeting thought, it became a persistent feeling, almost like an inner voice gently urging him to take action. Jake finally gave in and decided to volunteer. What he didn't know was that God was using that persistent thought to not only change the lives of others, but to transform Jake's own heart. When Jake arrived at the shelter, he encountered a man named Marcus, who had recently lost his job and was struggling to find hope. Over the course of the next few weeks, Jake found himself developing a close relationship with Marcus, offering support and encouragement. One day, Marcus broke down in tears, sharing how he had almost given up on life. But Jake's consistent presence and compassion gave him the strength to keep going. Eventually, Marcus found a job and began to rebuild his life. Jake's simple act of following that persistent thought changed the course of Marcus's future. That persistent thought, God's nudge, was not random. It was a divine calling, urging Jake to step out of his comfort zone and become a vessel of change. God speaks to us through these kinds of persistent, unexplainable thoughts because He has a purpose in mind. Sometimes those thoughts are invitations to step into His will, to be the hands and feet of Christ in a world that desperately needs hope. But why does God often use persistent thoughts to speak to us? One reason is that it requires us to step out in faith. These thoughts usually don't come with a clear and simple path laid out before us. Instead, they leave room for us to trust Him in the unknown. Just like Abraham, who was called to leave everything he knew and follow God to an unfamiliar land, we are often called to step into the unknown with nothing but our faith and the persistent thought that God is leading us. The journey doesn't always make sense at first, but if we trust God and follow through on those persistent ideas, we can often look back and see that He was leading us all along. In the Bible, God spoke to many individuals through persistent thoughts that led to significant action. Consider Moses. Moses had an unexplainable thought, an idea that stirred in his heart and mind. He was called to return to Egypt and free the Israelites. At first, Moses tried to push the thought away, making excuses about his inadequacy, his inability to speak well, and his fear of rejection. But God didn't let the thought fade. He kept bringing it back. And each time Moses hesitated, God responded with reassurance and provision. Ultimately, Moses obeyed, and through his obedience, the people of Israel were set free. Sometimes the thoughts that God plants in our minds are not big, world-changing events like Moses' mission, but they still carry deep significance. A persistent thought to call a friend, start a blog, invest in someone's life, or even pray for someone can have profound effects. These small actions, prompted by divine thoughts, ripple out and impact others in ways we may never fully understand. But when we act on those persistent thoughts, we become part of God's greater purpose. These thoughts are not always grand or monumental. Sometimes they seem like small, almost insignificant nudges. But we need to recognize that even in the small things, God is speaking. When you feel that nudge, That thought that keeps coming back, take it seriously. It's not just your imagination, it's the Holy Spirit leading you towards something important. It may be a step of faith you need to take, an opportunity for growth, or an act of kindness that will change someone's life. God speaks to us through persistent thoughts because He knows the power of our obedience. When we act on these thoughts, we exercise our faith, and that faith becomes a testimony to His goodness and faithfulness. Just like the story of Jake and Marcus, God can use our willingness to follow through on these persistent ideas to make an impact far beyond what we can see. If you've been experiencing a recurring thought or idea that seems to be pushing you toward action, don't dismiss it. Take time to reflect on it, pray about it, and ask God to give you clarity. Sometimes these persistent ideas are the seeds of something great, something that will not only change your life, but will also bless others in ways you can't yet imagine. Trust in God's timing and step forward in faith, knowing that He is guiding your every step. In the journey of faith, we must learn to recognize the subtle yet powerful ways that God speaks to us. He doesn't always speak through thunderous voices or dramatic signs. Instead, He uses a variety of methods through our circumstances, our emotions, the patterns in our lives, the deep peace amidst chaos, the sudden moments of clarity, the physical urges to pray, and the persistent thoughts that stir our hearts. These signs, though often quiet or unexplainable, carry profound meaning and direction. When God speaks through these signs, He is not simply offering advice or information. He is inviting us into a deeper relationship with Him. He is calling us to trust, to step out in faith, and to take action. Each sign is an opportunity to grow in understanding, obedience, and reliance on God's guidance. As you reflect on these signs in your own life, I encourage you to pause and listen. God may be trying to speak to you right now, nudging you to take the next step in your journey. Trust that His voice is present, even in the smallest of moments. His messages are often woven into the fabric of our daily lives, waiting for us to recognize and respond. God's communication with us is not random or incidental. It is intentional, loving, and full of purpose. Every time you recognize one of these physical signs, whether it's a repeated pattern, an unexpected urge to pray, or a sudden insight, know that He is with you, guiding you, and shaping you for something greater. The challenge is not in hearing His voice. It's in responding with courage, faith, and action. So, the next time you feel a deep peace amidst turmoil, or notice a persistent thought leading you to act, or experience a strange pattern repeating in your life, take a moment to reflect. Ask yourself, is this God speaking to me? And if it is, respond with trust, knowing that His plans for you are greater than you can imagine.